part of the reason I wanted to do this is because I think if we understand the context and some of the details of these other stories, we can clarify some of the confusing things that maybe we find in the Bible. And so we had a couple examples here, and I'll come back to a couple more in a moment. Um, we'll probably do this a little bit more instead of listing them. I mean, we'll probably kind of deal with them as we go. But one is the first part of Genesis 6, Genesis 6 verses 1 to 4. Much has been made of this passage where it talks about the sons of God and the women of men, and then you get the Rephaim and the Nephilim that come about. And there have been many theories about this. Basically since it was written, at least from the Second Temple period onward. And even today, especially in the evangelical church, you will get quite a wide variety of explanations. I've got a couple ideas about it that I'd like to discuss and that I think, to me, make more sense than some of the theories. So we'll come back to that as I explain it. We'll need some context. Another one that comes up is as Israel enters the promised land, they come up against a couple of figures. You have Sihon, king of the Amorites, and Og, king of Bashan. And in the middle of those stories, or towards the end, they describe the battles, and then they sort of describe what Og has. And there's this bed that is 9 cubits long. And that seems like a very specific detail. I know that Michael Heiser covers this and it pops up in a couple places, but I want to make a direct connection here with something else that's going to come up that is directly from the Babylonian traditions and rituals. The 9 cubits number is actually very specific and very important. There's also one more, and actually this wasn't on our list originally, but it's pretty interesting. I believe it's in Ezekiel 8. And I'm just going to cross-reference this. He has a vision of the temple, and at that point, there's a statue of the god Tammuz that's built there. And Tammuz is known as the dying god. He's not a super important figure in the stories. He actually gets blended into a couple other people, but that name comes up. The other name that comes up in scripture, actually more often, is Shemesh or Chemosh. Those are the same. One of the things, actually, I should take a small aside here. Throughout the ancient Near East, you have a lot of Semitic languages that are related to each other. They're cousins, and even to today, the remnants we have of Aramaic in things like Neo-Assyrian. And in the modern Arabic language, they use the same consonant. So across all these Semitic languages, with small variations, the consonants are the same. From language to language, the vowels and the grammar changes a little bit, how you arrange things and the vowels. So you get these names that are very similar and are shared. And that's where you can hear Shemesh and Chemosh, they're very similar to each other, right? It's kind of like even for Tammuz in the older Babylonian language, it's Demuzi. You get kind of the same letters to it there and just adjust it a little bit. I wanted to bring that up because that plays into a theory I want to share a little bit later on or in the future if we got to come back to it. I think it's pretty important in how this gets shaped or how we can understand it. So you get some of these things that are shared, and Shemesh especially. Shemesh is basically the word for the sun. And so you have the sun itself, but you also get the sun god. And of course, sun gods are very popular. They show up in almost every religion, mythology. And Shemesh or Chemosh or some variation of that is present in all of the ancient Near Eastern religions and pantheons. possibly the other famous use of it in the Bible is that Solomon builds an altar or a giant idol of Shemosh on the hills east of Jerusalem, and that's there late into the Kings before the exile. It's up there. The same passage. I'd have to find where it'd be in First Kings. He builds the one to Shemosh, and he also shoot, I'm blanking now. Who is the god that the children are sacrificed to in fire? Start
I
with
know the deity, but my mind is also stuck
yeah. It starts with an M, I think, but if I find it, we'll come back to it. So
mm,
these figures show up in the Canaanite religion, and the same guy is there basically in the Babylonian stories. So that's pretty interesting that it comes up, and they're sort of shared and they're present. Of course, they talk a lot about idols, but as we see, I think there is a principality behind these things. I think there's some smoke and mirrors going on, and we'll talk about that more too. That they seem to shift, and whether that's just hard to understand spiritual things, or let's assume these things are real, they're sort of trying to cover their identity so they can't be snuffed out too quick or sniffed out too quick. There's some of that going on as well, I think. So that's what's going on there. Probably one of the oldest stories that comes up is that of Gilgamesh, and we have the Epic of Gilgamesh. It is old, and I think it dates to about 2500 to 2700 BC. We know it's one of the older ones because throughout the Epic of Gilgamesh, the city of Ur and Uruk are very important. And those were more important cities in the kingdom or area of Sumer, which was the southern portion of what would become Babylon in the future. And they were, Sumer was more powerful in the sort of early periods. They had two out of the three major kingdoms. And in fact, archaeologists sort of date the periods by the construction and reconstruction of the city of Ur. So you if you go to look at the documents, you'll hear things about Ur 1, Ur 2, and Ur 3. And these are cities that were kind of rebuilt on top of each other as important centers. So Gilgamesh being at Ur and Uruk dates it pretty early because the power center shifts after that. But what's really interesting about Gilgamesh is that he's sort of a divine man, and his epic outright states early on that he's two-thirds divine and one-third human or mortal, and that comes from his parents. His father is sort of a mythical, legendary king. His status as a deity or divinity is kind of questionable. It seems like he's elevated, but because he was a powerful king, he has sort of this status. But his mother is a goddess. She goes by the name of Ninsun, and one of the translations I found kind of translates her as Lady Wild Cow. And through this, then that's how he gets the two-third divine and one-third human. We also have excavations from the modern day city of Warka that tell us about a time where Anu and Inanna or Ishtar were the primary deities. Those are older names. By the time you get the two kingdoms of Akkad and Sumer established, it's really Ea or Enki and Elul. So you get these generations of spirits that seem to kind of show up. And I think that's important to trace because we get some movement, and there's not really one supreme God through all of it, which is a direct contrast to what we see in the Bible and what we would believe about Jesus Christ. So that movement is very interesting to me on how it changes or shapes throughout the stories. About half the gods that I could find and read really kind of keep their character and name and domain, and the other half really kind of shift around. And Shemesh is one of them. Shemesh is very important in the Epic of Gilgamesh, and he almost nearly disappears later on. And so that's an interesting thing to me. Um, Gilgamesh, I think, is kind of important for three reasons. Number one, his epic says that he was the first one to record the flood story on stone tablets. That he's the one that brought the citizens the knowledge of it and some knowledge from before the flood and what was going on. So that's important. And there's actually two flood stories that kind of compete with each other, and I'll mention the second one in a second. So that's one thing. Number two, this whole thing about thirds, I find really interesting. The fact that he has thirds from two parents, as it's listed, is interesting. There is a ritual where I think you can end up with three parents, and that plays into Genesis 6 for me. It's how you could have two essentially humans mating, having intercourse, but ending up with a divine parent involved at the same time. But we'll have to wait for that because it's actually a little bit more related to Marduk. But I think it explains that this ritual understanding is going on in the background. I think it's also how you can get a woman that's in the city of Uruk, but is a goddess. That's interesting. That's very interesting.